Good afternoon. I'm Michael Nacht, Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy on the Berkeley campus, and it's really a distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce Senator Gary Hart to the Berkeley community. Gary Hart, of course, has been a national figure for several decades now, even though he's a young man. But some of his background is not that widely known, even to people who've been following his career. He actually is a graduate of a small church-related school, Southern Nazarene University in Bethany, Oklahoma, and then did graduate work in divinity. He's a graduate of the Yale Divinity School. He then went on to study law and graduated from Yale Law School in the same class with Bob Rubin and some other very distinguished alumni. Years later, actually, he returned to the academic world and received a doctorate in philosophy in DPhil in politics from Oxford University. So he spent a lot of time in the university environment. But of course, that's not what he's primarily known for in the general public and around the world. He has been a major political figure and a major thinker on national issues and national security issues for a very, very long time. In fact, this book, which he has just written and which is available for sale by Cody's outside the Chevron Auditorium, is, I believe, his 13th book. 13th book. Some of us haven't read 13 books. He has written 13 books. Gary Hart first became known, I think, to the national press as really a key strategist in the McGovern presidential campaign of 1972, where he met, among others, a young Arkansas fellow named Bill Clinton, a later-to-be National Security Advisor named Sandy Berger, a speechwriter named Bob Shrum, and quite a number of famous luminaries. As some of us remember, the McGovern campaign didn't quite turn out the way some had hoped, so there was time afterward to do things. And not very long thereafter, Gary Hart was elected to public office and, of course, became a very prominent U.S. senator from his home state of Colorado, and was a candidate for presidency of the United States on the Democratic ticket in the 1980s. At least for the last 10 or 15 years, Gary Hart has really made a concerted effort to understand the future and the challenges of U.S. national security policy. And he was the leading intellectual and organizational figure behind the so-called Hart-Rudman Commission. And the Hart-Rudman Commission, which maybe not all of you know, was first published in 1999, went through 3 different phases, and explicitly predicted a large-scale terrorist attack on the American homeland. But this was not taken up in any operationally significant way in the end of the Clinton administration or in the first part of the Bush administration. Unfortunately, we have now seen that their prediction has come to pass. So Gary Hart has continued to write and think and speak and advise on national security issues. And the latest product of his thinking is National Security in the Age of Terror. So please welcome Senator Gary Hart to Berkeley.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much. Dean Nacht, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being here. I am delighted and honored to be back on this great campus and at this very well-known public policy school. And I want to thank Dean Nacht and the administration of the school for their hospitality and kind invitation to be here. Let me assure those of you, particularly in the back of the hall, that there will not be a collection taken up, so if you would like to move forward, you would be very welcome down here with the rest of us. And if there weren't cameras and lights here, I would have this microphone off this very high stage, and I'd be right down there with you. Nevertheless, we are all the subject to the powers of the media. Our story begins today in 1946 and 47. That was a period in which, of course, the United States had successfully participated in and led in a Western democratic coalition in the defeat of fascism in Europe. And having come out of a period of, rather prolonged period of more or less isolationism in terms of our role in the world, the question then became, in that critical period just at the middle of the 20th century, what do we do now? What should America do now that World War II is over? And a series of committees and commissions were appointed by the then Truman administration, and people like Dean Acheson and George Marshall and a number of significant Americans, both in the public sector and the private sector, participated in those deliberations. And it was a very interesting period in American history, because the fundamental issue was, would the United States go back to a more or less semi-isolationist position, protecting North America and its borders and pretty much letting the rest of the world go on? But having participated in both cases somewhat reluctantly in 2 world wars, the prevailing theory was, if we do that, in 10 or 20 or 30 years, we could be back right where we started, in another world war. So we probably are going to have to play some sort of role in this new post-war emerging world. About that time, very well, not a well-known, but a young, very bright diplomat, career diplomat named George Kennan, then posted in Moscow in the U.S. Embassy in Russia, in the Soviet Union, wrote a very famous memorandum that became later, months later, a Foreign Affairs article by an anonymous Mr. X, still Mr. Kennan. And of course, it was that memorandum and that article that formulated the idea that became the central organizing principle of American foreign policy for the better part of the remainder of the 20th century, almost 50 years. This central organizing principle, a strategy, perhaps a grand strategy, if you will, had the virtue of simplicity, something that those of us in politics know is an extraordinary virtue. The simpler it is, the easier it is to sell politically. And this simple central organizing principle could also had the benefit of being able to be put on a bumper strip. It was 3 words. You all know what it was: containment of communism. That was what Mr. Kennan suggested rather strongly, that it was the job of America and its allies to contain the spread of Soviet communism. And as I say, we used that principle, a very simple and understandable proposition, to guide American foreign policy and defense policy for the better part of the remainder of the 20th century, certainly from 1947 to 1991. In 1947, these committees and commissions led to the enactment of the National Security Act of 1947, which became the statutory basis for the prosecution of what came to be called the Cold War. And it was that legislation that created, first of all, a permanent Department of Defense to replace the old War Department. It created a new Central Intelligence Agency. It created a National Security Council, and it created the United States Air Force as a 4th branch of our military. And it was that legislation that carried us for the next 45 or 47 years. As I say, that worked wonderfully well, on and off, under 7 or 8 administrations, Democrats and Republicans. And it was a consensus strategy and policy. It guided not only our foreign affairs. If you were the enemy of our enemy, you tended to be our friend, even if you were an autocratic or oligarchic or repressive dictatorial government. If you were anti-communist, we were on your side, and you were on our side. If you were friendly to the Soviets, sometimes if we had a chance, we would overthrow you and put our own government in. We went so far in some cases as to try to assassinate foreign leaders. I served on an extraordinary Senate Select Committee in 1975-76, the first 2 years I served in the Senate. It was called the United States Senate Select Committee to investigate the intelligence agencies of the United States government. And it was the first time since the enactment of that policy and that legislation that anyone had taken a look at the intelligence services. And of course it was that committee, the so-called Church Committee, after its late chairman, Frank Church, the senator from Idaho, that disclosed these bad performances by the CIA and other agencies, largely under the direction of political leadership of one White House or the other. That's a separate story we can discuss later if you wish. And as I said, this central organizing principle of containment of communism pretty much guided us throughout that period, not only abroad but also at home. If you wanted, as Dwight Eisenhower wanted, to increase, after the launching of the Soviet Sputnik satellite, increase investment in education, you had to justify it by saying it was part of this containment of communism. So we financed increased scientific education in America in the 1950s by calling it the National Defense Education Act, and we built an interstate highway system by calling it the National Defense Highway System, theoretically so people could flee the cities in case of nuclear attack. But that's how dominant this idea of containment of communism was, and it was always well and good strategically and conceptually at least until a 72-hour period at the end of August 1991, and of course the Soviet Empire collapsed. The formal collapse occurred 3 or 4 months later, but that was the weekend of the coup against the Gorbachev regime, and the Soviet Union never recovered. So what was America to do? Here we were in 1991 without a principal enemy and without a central organizing principle or grand strategy. We pretty much drifted for the next 10 years, almost exactly 10 years. And in the book that Dean Nacht was kind enough to mention, The Fourth Power, in the appendix, there is an excerpted memorandum that I sent President William Clinton on November 5th, 1993. 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the first full year of the Clinton administration. And I said that I thought he should formulate a new grand strategy for the United States to fill the vacuum left by the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the idea of containment of communism. And the title of the memorandum is Elements of a New Grand Strategy. And that's what this book is about, because in that 10-year period after August 91, there was no strategy for the United States, no definition of what America's role in the world should be. And I think either Secretary of State Madeleine Albright or National Security Advisor Sandy Berger was asked in 95 or 96, what is the Clinton administration's strategy? And whichever one of them it was said, we do not have a strategy, we respond to events as they occur. Well, that in and of itself is a strategy. It's a reactive strategy. It essentially says the world is chaotic, we cannot order it or organize it or even attempt to, so we will simply put together a policy to deal with every problem as it arises. It turned out there were quite a few. Somalia, Rwanda. Somalia, we intervened. Of course, you remember Black Hawk Down. Some Americans were killed. We got out. Rwanda, we did nothing. 800,000 people died. President Clinton has since said that was one of the worst mistakes of his administration for not intervening. So This is one of the problems of not having a strategy, is that in dealing with problems as they arise, you have no structure in which to think about how to deal with them. Then, of course, came the dreadful events of 9/11, more than 3 years ago. And what then filled the vacuum on September the 20th, 2001, was President Bush's speech to the Congress and the nation when he declared war on terrorism. So today, the de facto strategy of the United States is centered around the war on terrorism. Well, I want to talk about that in a very few minutes, but I want to first of all think about conceptually what strategy is and what grand strategy is. Strategy, when you mention it to people, they almost always think about it in a military context. And that's appropriate, because that's the way the word is almost always used. What is our military strategy in Iraq? What's our military strategy in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera? But grand strategy is, by definition, a bigger project. And it, in a sentence, is the application of a nation's powers to the achievement of its large purposes. And that seems like a pretty straightforward proposition, except it raises two very critical questions. What are our powers? And even more importantly, what are our large purposes? You cannot apply your powers to your large purposes if you don't know what they are. And so to say that a nation of 300 million people, a mass democracy of 300 million people, ought to have large purposes and debate and define those is to suggest a very significant undertaking. And ideally, in an ideal world, the first election of a new century would be the occasion in which that debate would occur, where two parties and two candidates, or two parties and three candidates, or whatever, would have a contest to define what America's large purposes in the 21st century are, what our powers are, and how we apply those powers to achieve those purposes. Well, let's undertake that exercise just to stimulate our minds. Excuse me. I'm sorry. There's an epigram that I think is worth reading just because it makes the point in a particularly poignant way given where we are in Iraq today. This is from a noted British historian and strategist, B.H. Hart, no relation to my knowledge, who wrote a book called Strategy in the mid-1950s. And here's what he says. While the horizon of strategy is bounded by war, grand strategy looks beyond war to the subsequent peace. It should not only combine the various instruments of economics and diplomacy and so forth, he says ethical behavior, but so regulate their use as to avoid damage to the future state of peace for its security and prosperity. The sorry state of peace. Interesting phrase. The sorry state of peace that has followed most wars can be traced to the fact that, unlike strategy, the realm of grand strategy is, for the most part, terra incognita, still awaiting exploration and understanding. So what he is saying is it's one thing to have a strategy to win a war, but the fact that nations who make wars don't have grand strategies for the follow-on use of all their other powers, their diplomacy or their political power, their financial and economic power, and so forth, often leads to that striking phrase, the sorry state of peace. Now, if that doesn't describe America's situation in Iraq, I don't know what does. The sorry state of peace, and we're in that sorry state of peace because we didn't have a grand strategy. Okay, what are America's powers? Well, traditionally, for any nation, particularly superpower, you have three: economic, political, and military. In all three traditional categories, we are head and shoulders above anyone else in the world. Our economy in terms of gross domestic product or output or any one of a number of quantitative measures is larger than the next 4, 5, or perhaps even 6 economies in the world. That's extraordinary. That includes Germany, Japan, Great Britain, and others. At least 4, and probably as large as or larger than the next 5 or 6. So we're way ahead of any other single nation in terms of economic power. Politically, we have a far-flung diplomatic network. We have representatives and agencies in virtually every nation of the world except some really threatening ones like Cuba and a couple of places like that. But in 180 or 85 or more, there's an embassy, there's an American presence, and a striking number of those countries, we have a military presence of some kind. So no one rivals us in terms of our political power. Militarily, it's not even close. America in the next 5 years, sometime in the next 1 to 5 years, will spend more on its military than all of the rest of the world combined. I'll say that again. Sometime in the next 5 years, the United States, we will spend more on our military power than all of the rest of the world combined. That's all of Europe, that's Russia, that's China, that's everybody. Now, we take that for granted, but just let me give you an historic reference point. At the height of its powers, Great Britain, in the 19th century, the most powerful nation on earth, gauged its military expenditures by estimating, by the number of ships being built and men under arms, what its next 2 major rival powers were spending, whether France and Germany or France and Spain or Germany and someone else. They estimated an estimate of what those next two countries were spending, and that's what they allocated to their military. The British Empire, 2 countries. They used 2 countries. We will have more than all the rest of the world combined. So that's American power, economic, political, and military. Well, that was easy. Now the question is, what are our large purposes? It would have been interesting, I think, for some super institution in America to say to the Democratic Party, Republican Party, Green Party, Reform Party, your candidates have one qualification to run for president. They must take a pad and paper and be given 1 or 2 hours, half a day, and they must come back with a grand strategy for the United States. Would certainly have narrowed the field, wouldn't it? Didn't happen, and it's certainly not happening now. You can say, well, that's too complicated. Well, let me give you 3 large purposes and expand on those. First of all, to achieve security. We are living in an insecure world, particularly post 9/11. So one of America's larger purposes is to achieve security for ourselves and cooperate in the security of our allies. The second is to expand opportunity, to create economic opportunity here at home and to do as much as we can to help others have some kind of at least minimal economic opportunity. And the third is to promote liberal democracy. Now, I don't want to get Rush Limbaugh all excited, but as a foreign policy expert, Fareed Zakaria, who's the international editor for Newsweek, has pointed out in a recent book a year or 2 ago, democracy is about more than just voting for a national leader. That's the minimum threshold. Liberal democracy has a lot more to it. Liberal in the old-fashioned sense of the word. It means a rule of law. It means the sanctity and protection of property rights. It means opposition politics, a free press, equal rights for women and all other people. You get the idea. So it's more than just having a national election and a free or semi-free one at that. It also involves a lot of these other structural matters. Okay, So achieving security, expanding opportunity, and promoting liberal democracy. Those are the three large purposes, and we know what the powers are. Now you say, well, is it possible for a presidential candidate to really write down a grand strategy in 100 words or less? Well, I do so, or I give you one American's idea of what that might sound like, going through the exercise of identifying our powers and applying them to the large purposes that I've identified. And here's what I come up with as a grand strategy for the United States: to transform our domestic economy from one of consumption to one of production, and through long-term investments, to recapitalize our education and technology base and achieve energy security, to use the forces of globalization and information to strengthen and expand existing democratic alliances and create new ones, to employ these alliances to destroy terrorist networks and establish new security structures, and guided by our historic principles, to lead international coalitions in spreading economic opportunity and liberal democracy, and in nation-building, counter-proliferation of weapons, and environmental protection. That's a grand strategy, fewer than 100 words. So it's not impossible. Again, in an ideal world, in the first debate, September 30th, the two candidates would stand up and read what they think America's grand strategy should be. President Bush, Senator Kerry, anyone else running for president that wants to. Now you can say, well, that's all very kind of academic. It's not. If you don't have a structured set of thinking about your country and its role in the world, in a revolutionary age, you are going to stumble from one mistake to the other, or you'll make the even bigger mistake, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, when I say revolutionary world, here's what I'm talking about. Most people think we entered the 21st century, and it was really, except for all the Y2K business, it's pretty much the same as the 20th century. Big mistake. This age is a revolutionary age on multiple levels. I mentioned a couple of them in my grand strategy. Globalization, the internationalization of finance and commerce and markets is fundamentally changing the world. It's breaking down national boundaries. It's shifting jobs across halfway around the globe. It's upsetting communities. It's creating great turmoil. That would be historic and epic by itself, but simultaneously with globalization has occurred an equally profound revolution, and that's the information revolution. You have to go back to the early part of the 19th century in the Industrial Revolution to find a period of such equivalent economic upheaval, the transformation of an agrarian economy to industrialized economy, the computer chip and all that has gone with it has revolutionized our economy and those of advanced nations at least as much as the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago. So here together you have two epic revolutions simultaneously, globalization and the information revolution. They have led to the third revolution, which we're beginning to see more and more, and that's the erosion of the sovereignty of nation states. Nation states have only existed about 3 or 3.5 centuries. They are based on bargains between states or governments and nations or people, by which the state or government guarantees some economic stability and security to the nation or the people in exchange for their loyalty. When things like globalization and the information revolution take away the ability of the state to guarantee security, you get the fourth revolution, which is the transformation of war. And we saw that here in catastrophic and dramatic ways 3 years ago. Wars are not going to be fought by soldiers in the field facing armies as they were for 3 centuries. Now what you have are people not in uniform taking airliners and killing people not in uniform, civilian targets, for no particular political agenda. This is the transformation of war. This is a totally new kind of conflict. Our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq are facing a variation of the same thing: house-to-house fighting, intensive urban warfare involving tribes, clans, and gangs. This is the fourth revolution. So when I say we're living in a revolutionary age and we can't just ad hoc America's role in that age, that's what I'm talking about. Things are changing dramatically, and we must have ways of understanding those changes and being prepared to deal with them. What is the option? I mentioned there was one other option, and that's what I think our government is pursuing right now. That option is called empire. That is to take all of that power that I mentioned, economic, political, and military, out into the world that is changing and in some ways collapsing, and try to structure that world in our image. And that's exactly what's happening in Iraq today. This isn't about the war on terrorism. The people that formulated the invasion of Iraq had a plan to overthrow Saddam Hussein more than 10 years ago. They announced it publicly as early as 1991. Almost all of them signed a letter to President Clinton in 1998 saying we must get rid of Saddam Hussein. When they came into power, Richard Clarke, who I think was here a few days ago or a couple of weeks ago, has already reported that when he tried to talk to the new administration about the threat of terrorism, they didn't want to hear it. All they wanted to talk about was Saddam Hussein. So here you have a set of policymakers who had a grand plan. It wasn't a strategy, not a grand strategy, but it was a grand plan. The United States would overthrow an evil dictator in the center of the greater Middle East. We would position a friendly democratic government to us that would enable us to put our political and military forces in that area. By using the pressure from those forces, we would condition the behavior of Iran, Syria, and virtually everyone else in the whole area, and we would guarantee the supply of oil from the Persian Gulf. Now you can say, well, that's a heck of an idea. That's really a big idea. There's only one problem with it. It was never disclosed to the American people. I say in the book, and I won't, this is the only passage that I will read, but it expresses what I'm trying to say here today. There's a British historian teaching in the United States called Neil Ferguson, who's written a good deal about this. His basic thesis is that the United States is an empire and we ought to just get on with it. But he says, I don't actually advocate a declaration that America is an empire. It would greatly alarm American voters who continue to bask in the illusion that their country's vast overseas military commitments and economic engagements and regular military interventions are in some strange way the actions of a non-empire. Well, he's certainly right about the alarm, but he's wrong about the illusions. The fear of alarming the citizens of the United States is well taken. To publicly promote an American colonial empire and advocate its expansion is not a path calculated to achieve political success and widespread public acceptance. Why is that? It's because we salute the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands. Why do we not say democracy? It's because the founders, the people who created this country, thought and wrote and talked in the language of the republic, the ancient Greek city-state, the Roman Republic, the ideas of Machiavelli and others since then, the ideas of the European Enlightenment. They sought to create on this continent something that had never occurred before, that is, a republic on a grand scale. What is a republic? A republic has, throughout history, 2,800 years, certain characteristics: civic duty, citizen participation. More than 50% of the qualified voters in America are not voting. Popular sovereignty. The king is not sovereign, the president is not sovereign, the people are sovereign. Resistance to corruption. Corruption was defined by the ancient republicans with a small r, not as bribery, but is putting special interest ahead of the common good. By that definition, the American Republic in the 21st century is a massively corrupt republic. And finally, the sense of the common good or commonwealth itself, what we all own in common, what we all pass on to future generations. Those are the qualities of a republic. They are totally antithetical with an empire. So if, in fact, the current administration has in mind to create an American empire, and I think that's exactly what we are doing, or attempting to do, except the insurgents are not buying it, then they ought to tell the American people that, because the price we will pay for that American empire in the 21st century is the loss of the American Republic. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Hart. We have a very large number of questions, far more than we can accommodate, I'm afraid, but we do have about half an hour or so, 25 minutes to go over some of them. So I've grouped a few of them into different categories. A few of them initially just begin with the issue of a grand strategy. So let me start with this question. Can the United States, a nation built on the principle of individual freedom, be united behind any purpose that's less compelling than a threat to individual and collective security? Do you have to have a threat out there to have a grand strategy?
It's a very good question, and I've thought a lot about it myself. Any national leader will tell you it's much easier to unite 300 million people against something than for something. If we are threatened, if somebody attacks us, as with the terrorists, if there is a Great Depression, if the country itself is attacked, then you can unite Americans against those who perpetuated that attack. To state a positive agenda, even in the most general terms that I tried to do here today, and suggest how that might be achieved, already starts Americans with highly individualized ideas saying, well, no, I don't think we ought to put emphasis on expansion of liberal democracy because that's a secondary consideration. We ought to do this instead. And then you begin to get the popular debate and the society fragment. So admittedly, trying to organize or get a consensus, not universal agreement, but some sort of moderate consensus, if you will, behind some general goals for the country and then allocate our resources to achieve those goals is a very, very difficult task. It takes great leadership. It takes education of the American people, and it takes a process of explaining why it's better to do it that way than to respond to the world ad hoc. We are in Iraq today because we responded to the world ad hoc. This president and this administration were warned that terrorists were going to attack us. They didn't pay any attention. So then terrorists attack us, and then they begin to put together a policy. They had the time to do that ahead of time, both to prepare our country for that attack and hopefully prevent it, but also to begin to put together a long-term plan to deal with the roots and the causes of terrorism, not just Al-Qaeda, but why do people hate us? Why do people resent America? What is going on out there? Do they really not understand us? Are they really put off by our commercial culture? These are the kind of questions that should have been asked before 9/11. Right now, we have so narrowly focused our energies and our talent and our resources on well, first getting bin Laden, and then secondarily this long-held scheme of dominating the Middle East in the name of terrorism, that we've lost all focus on where America ought to be headed. It is a difficult task, but it's not impossible, and it has happened a few times in our history.
You mentioned about Richard Clarke being here a couple of weeks ago, and one questioner says that he recalls Richard Clarke saying that you cannot declare war on a tactic, terrorism. So what is your sense of war on terrorism as itself a strategy? And by the way, how are we doing?
Someone commented that declaring war on terrorism would have been the equivalent in World War II would have been to declare war on blitzkrieg. Right. Terrorism is a method; it's not an ideology. The ideology behind the method of terrorism is that Western culture, as represented by the United States, and particularly its commercial aspects, but also its entertainment, its social values, and so on, is a threat to the fundamental values of at least one religion, Islam, by at least one set of people interpreting the values of Islam, namely fundamentalist Islam, and therefore the only response to protect Islam is to attack the sources of those threats. That is the theory of terrorism. When you begin to understand it that way, then you understand that the military solution by itself is not going to solve the problem. It simply cannot. We will get eventually Mr. bin Laden, but right now I am no expert on the subject and certainly don't have access to classified briefings, but everything I hear and read, including from intelligence sources and others, is that the terrorist threat is metastasizing. It is not simply Al-Qaeda anymore. It is spreading parts of the globe that we didn't even have to worry about in the past, that there are connections being made between terrorist organizations and mafias, and between mafias and drug cartels, and the whole network is beginning to, as I say, metastasize. So it's going to take a lot more than the 82nd Airborne Division or 1st Marine Expeditionary Division to solve this problem. It's a symptom.
Coupling your reflections on the origins of U.S. strategy in the Cold War with the current situation today, one questioner asks, should U.S. strategy regarding Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups focus on containment and defensive measures or on eradication of such groups?
I think you have to get down to definitions now. I can only visualize this. I mean, I can only deal with this by visualizing it, and if I had a chalkboard, I would try to draw a picture, and it would be a series of concentric circles. In the middle, there would be a circle, I would call it, for lack of a better word, Al-Qaeda. And it would be anywhere from 10 to 100,000 people, 10,000 to 100,000 people. They are committed to kill us. They do not want to hear any reason. They do not want economic development. They would not be satisfied if we abandon our relationship with Israel today. They would still want to kill us. I think for that circle, the only solution is military and paramilitary. The second circle gets more interesting and complicated. This is a circle containing those who support the inner circle. That includes our good friends, the Saudis. We attacked Iraq when the Saudis gave more comfort in material ways to Al-Qaeda than Iraq ever did. I mean, this administration tried to concoct some relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Apparently simply didn't exist. But hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars were flowing out of Saudi Arabia into terrorist organizations. Weapons, people, we know the number of the original attackers who were Saudis. So nobody's marching on Riyadh to overthrow the royal family of Saudi Arabia. But there you have part of the problem. And here you have to face up to a very basic fact, and that is when you begin to analyze the problem, you're right in the middle of America's energy policy. When I was a national candidate 20 years ago, I said, if America continues to import 50% of its oil from, a lot of it from the most unreliable, unstable region of the world, we will go to war for that oil. And we have gone to war for that oil twice since then, and we will continue to go to war for that oil. I don't believe that was the principal reason for invading Iraq, but to say that oil had nothing to do with it is just crazy. It had a lot to do with Gulf War I, and it had to do with Gulf War II. When are we going to change that energy policy? People say we don't have an energy policy. We do. It is to continue to drive inefficient automobiles and to import the oil for those automobiles from abroad. And if that oil gets cut off, to sacrifice the lives of our sons and daughters for that oil. That's an energy policy. It just happens to be immoral. But that's U.S. energy policy. You've got a third circle, and those are people who resent us. They don't hate us, but they resent us. And the commission that I served on, the U.S. Commission on National Security for the 21st Century, that issued the original warnings about terrorism, traveled to 25 countries throughout the former Soviet Union, Europe, Asia, Middle East, and elsewhere. And uniformly, when members of the commission came back, we reported resentment. People resent America. Some of it is the way we use our power. And by the way, this is 98, 99, and 2000, long time before 2001 or the invasion of Iraq. They resent our commercial culture, our exportation of fast foods and movies and Governor Schwarzenegger movies, Michael Jackson music. They think we're polluting and corrupting their youth, but they're not doing a whole lot about getting their kids not to consume that stuff. They blame us for it, so there's widespread resentment. There is resentment that America is the dominant power on the globe, and now a lot more of that resentment by our invasion of Iraq than existed even before. So when you talk about a strategy for dealing with terrorism, I think you've got to look at those circles as they expand, because the more you get away from the inner circle, the more complicated the problem becomes, and the less it lends itself to a military solution.
Actually, as a dean at Berkeley, I'm very familiar with the distinction between people who hate you and people who just, are antagonistic. I've been dealing with this for years. There are a number of questioners who are trying to understand the relationship of the promotion of democracy to U.S. strategy. So let me see if I can sandwich a couple of questions for you on this. One questioner says, given that there are many countries that have functioned seemingly perfectly well for hundreds of years under governments which are not democratic, tribal, religious, monarchies, and so forth, why should we be in the business of promoting democracy there? And a somewhat related question, a questioner mentions that in President Bush's speech today at the United Nations, he mentioned his administration's purpose is to spread democracy. In your opinion, is the Bush definition actually spreading the promotion of liberal democracy?
Well, the key words here, of course, are the verb spreading and promoting. There is no way in the world, I'd be amazed if anyone here thinks we can impose democracy on an undemocratic society at the point of a bayonet. It's just simply not going to work. So when the president talks, the devil is always in the details. When the president says spread democracy, I think he's probably talking about something that I'm not talking about. When I talk about promote, I'm talking about offering. If there are nations in the world, large or small, that want to replicate some version of, not an ideal, not an exact image or copy of our system or parts of our system, we should be there to offer any kind of assistance we can, particularly in institution building of economic institutions, banking systems, lending institutions, so forth, but more importantly, political institutions. I think we should have done an awful lot more in Russia in the 1990s to help build those kind of political institutions. There were too many Americans interested in making a fast buck, getting to the oil supplies, and so on, but no consistent policy of helping individual groups of Russians form political parties, create newspapers, do things like that. Now, there is a fine line here between offering to help and imposition. And it's going to be up to individuals and organizations as to when they cross that line. When you meet resistance and people say, wait a minute, that may be fine in your country, we're not going to do that here, that's, I think, when you probably say, fine, that's okay. When you want to think about it, let me know. But right now, I I think what's going on in the Middle East, as I said, was a secret policy, not disclosed to the American people, and it was to impose democracy on the region. Iraq is not a nation. Iraq is an artificial construct created by the British and the French. British, really, after World War I. Much of the Middle East, as you know, was cobbled together in terms of the structure of nations by the French and the British after the end of World War I. And you've got three separate clans, at least, sectarian groups that make up Iraq today. It was an artificial nation. Poland is a unified nation. Virtually all people in Poland are Poles. Iraq is an artificial nation, and the reason it had dictators of one kind or another, the British have tried to impose a monarch, and that didn't work out. And in fact, the chaos after the monarch collapsed or was overthrown was only resolved by Saddam Hussein becoming the dictator and saying Shiites are not going to kill Sunnis and Sunnis are not going to kill Shiites, and neither one are going to kill Kurds. If anybody's going to get killed, I'm going to do it. And that was the way Iraq was governed. Now, we don't like it. It was undemocratic, but we're about to see what the opposite alternative is. If a majority of Iraqis or Lebanese or anybody else want a stable, flourishing, functioning democracy, they can have it, and we ought to be there to help them any way we can. But we cannot impose it, and particularly with military force.
A number of people are interested in your specific views on current specific issues, so let me try a few. With your Homeland Security expertise hat on, why do you think there has not been another attack on the homeland here since 9/11?
I think we've been very, very lucky. Every terrorism expert I'm aware of, and I am not one, is unified in one single belief, and that is America will be attacked again, and more than once. We know two things about Al-Qaeda, at least. One is it's very patient. It's a very patient organization. It will take years to carry out a plan. And second, Al-Qaeda tends to do what they say. There was an expert I heard on NPR the other day, I can't remember, journalist I think named Cole, who has a book out, the title of which escapes me, but it is a book on Al-Qaeda.
Steve Cull from the Washington Post. Steve Cull from the Washington Post.
Exactly. And he said a very interesting thing. He said, I don't know what all the mystery is about Al-Qaeda. He says, bin Laden has stated ahead of time every time he was going to carry out an attack. He doesn't do that just every day. When he says we're going to attack America, an attack occurs, whether it's the embassies in Africa or the USS Cole or whatever. So, and he's been, as I think you all know, saying we're going to attack America. So I think at the very least, we've been given warning. Are we prepared? I don't believe so. The commission I co-chaired urged President Bush, January 31st, 2001, to create a consolidated Department of Homeland Security, basically for two reasons. One, the pieces of securing our country from outside attack were scattered all over the federal government. Take the border agencies alone. You had the Customs Service in the Treasury Department. You had the Coast Guard in the Transportation Department, not even in the Pentagon. You had Border Patrol in the Justice Department. They didn't have a common communication system or a common database. How can you defend the borders of this country? So that in and of itself told us that we ought to begin to put these people together. Then you get issues like the massive quantities of food that come into this country subject to salmonella poisoning and anthrax poisoning. Now they're being inspected by agents of the Agriculture Department for salmonella. Well, that may have been the threat before 9/11. Anthrax and botulism and a lot of other things are the threat now. So you can get the idea. The other reason was the practical reason, to get these people under one roof so they could work together. The second was a constitutional principle. That was accountability. No one was held accountable for 3,000 Americans dead, up to and including the president. There is one central premise of democracy, and that is our elected officials and appointed officials must be held accountable for the performance of their duties. 3,000 Americans died. Not one American lost his job in the government. No one was held accountable. Harry Truman said the buck stops here, not this president. He did not take responsibility. He did not assume responsibility, even though he had been warned. So on a scale of 1 to 10, are we prepared for that attack? I think we're at about a 3. And I think that the nation will sober up by November the 2nd, and I think we'll change presidents. I certainly pray so. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.